New economic figures from China. What do they tell us about the strength of its economy? And could they have a global impact? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. China has released new economic performance numbers that indicate continued growth. The semi-annual data shows GDP expanding over the first half of the year as the country's economy forges ahead. Major economic indicators like retail sales and industrial output did well, but there are also some cautionary areas. We begin with this report from CGTN correspondent Liu Jiaxin in Beijing.
China's GDP grew at 12.7% year-on-year in the first half of 2021, down 5.6 percentage points from the first quarter. At the same time, growth for China's consumer price index, the main gauge of inflation in the first half of the year, was 3.3 percentage points lower than the same period last year. A spokesperson for the National Bureau of Statistics says falling food prices are the main reason for the decline.
今年上半年食品价格是下降0.2%。
In the first half of this year, food prices dropped 0.2% year-on-year, compared with a 16.2% rise in the same period last year. Food prices, once the main driver of higher consumer prices, are now the main cause of lower consumer prices.
Data also shows the unemployment rate for urban youth aged 16 to 24 was about 15% in June, up 1.6 percentage points from the previous month. The spokesperson says structural problems in employment are becoming more pronounced.
It is true that the scale of college graduates this year reached 9.09 million, a record high. The total employment pressure is indeed relatively large.
In general, China's animal husbandry and high-tech manufacturing sectors also rapid growth in the first half of the year. However, the growth rate of the household income was slightly lower than the economic growth rate. Liu Jiaxin, CGTN, Beijing.
Lots to discuss. Joining me now from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Also with us here in Washington, D.C. is Jeff Moon. He served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China during the Obama administration. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Yanliang. She is a professor of economics at Willamette University. And from Belfast, Northern Ireland, joining us is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs, and he's a commentator on European politics. Welcome to all of you. Einar Tangen, let me start with you, and let's look at those numbers again. China's GDP expanded by 12.7% for the first half of 2021, but for the second quarter, GDP growth, the rate stands at 7.9%. What do you make of these new numbers?
The new numbers support that China will easily exceed its 6% target growth rate. But, China continues to forge ahead. The problem is you have a tale of two perspectives. If you start reading the international press, China's on, it's very disappointing, and China's once again on the verge of collapse. If you actually look at the data and what China's achieved during this period, you'll see that it's very hopeful. Remember, this period, this quarter, reflects China having already gotten back to business last year. That's why you're not seeing that huge increase that you saw in Q1, where China was shut down last year, and this year it was expanding. So China continues very well, but the perspectives continue to influence the narrative.
Jeff Moon, the Wall Street Journal, while pointing out the slowing growth rate in the second quarter, also noted that China's economy continues to show, in the Wall Street Journal's words, unusual resilience. What is your overview on what we're seeing right now?
I think this is encouraging news. China continues to emerge from the influence of COVID. I think that the year-on-year numbers are really not the numbers to look at. It's the two-year annualized numbers. And despite the good news, the economic resurgence of China is still a little bit less than it was before COVID, so there's improvement that needs to be made. But this is encouraging. I think that the world, both medically and in terms of and economically, does not get well unless everyone gets well. And so I hope the Chinese economy continues on this trajectory and it continues to be a growth engine for the world.
Jeff, what do you make of what Einar Tangen was talking about a moment ago? And this is international perceptions of China, that there is one perception that says, well, look, that's fine, but not good enough.
Oh, I think that Einar is looking at the negative aspects of the commentary, but the bigger picture here is that there are positive and less positive areas here. There are areas of concern in the Chinese economy. COVID is number one. COVID is resurging everywhere. We do not know what influence that is going to have. There are other troubling signs there. There are record defaults on local bonds in China, for example. And there are not enough domestic economic drivers to ensure that the growth continues as we would like it to. But overall, we're certainly in a much better place than we were last year. And China is one of the major economic drivers of the world economy, and I hope it continues to get well.
Yanliang, some of the economic indicators show industrial output was up 15.9%, and retail sales were up 23% year on year in the first half. What is your overall assessment of these numbers?
Right. So I agree with the first two speakers. So we're seeing right now is more sort of sustained growth and also more balanced growth as opposed to be, accelerating growth. And so that leads a lot of commentators to say that China's recovery or growth peaked out. But be that as it may, I think what is more important is whether or not that growth can be sustained by, consumer demand domestically, and whether or not that demand growth is going to be more balanced. In other words, we're not going to rely too much on infrastructure or property development to drive that growth, but more by service sector expansion and by consumer demand. So I think once that base year effect washes out, as Einar Tangen talked about, last year, the first quarter, the economy shrank by 6.8%. So that's why you see the first quarter this year, the GDP growth jumped by 18.3%. So I think, the second quarter growth rate is slower, right, by that perspective. The growth rate for the second quarter is 7.9%. But again, what we see here is solidified growth and more balanced growth. And also export growth has been really strong by 32.3% for the second quarter. Imports also surged. So I think overall, the data showed us that the growth has been solidified and also more balanced. But there is the concern about youth unemployment rate, as the reporter has reported. But also, we see that 7 million jobs, urban jobs, were being created this half of the year, and that accounted for more than half of the 11 million job targets for the entire year. So I think there are still really strong, tailwinds, and also inflation rate was pretty low at 1.1%. So I think we're expect to see pretty solid growth for this year.
Yanliang, I want to get to those jobs numbers in a moment, but as Einar Tangen pointed out a moment ago, he's confident that China will reach its growth target of 6% for this year. Do you share that optimism?
Yes, I think most of the international research agencies like World Bank or IMF have all predicted much higher growth rate, right? 8% growth rate for China. So I think it's very likely that China is going to exceed that 6% growth rate. But that said, I think the policymaker deliberately not to increase the growth target too high, because remember, the whole policy goal is not to have accelerated growth or high growth rate, but target more towards the quality growth. In other words, for example, when China in this first half, we have seen really solid efforts to reduce carbon emission, right? To reduce coal mining and also coal-fired plants. So I think, with all these other goals in mind, it is important not to just trying to look at the growth rate, but really, where the growth comes from and the quality of the growth rate. I think that's much more important than just setting a high growth rate and achieve that.
Klaus Larres, of course, everyone around the world is looking at how countries emerge from the pandemic. China, of course, is the world's second largest economy. How important is a healthy Chinese economy for Europe?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it is a mixed picture, but on the whole, there is a good degree of progress has been made in China, and that is very much welcomed in Europe. You know, both the Chinese consumer and Chinese factories are absolutely essential for trade, for businesses and for industrial companies in Europe. And as you know, the car market of China is very important for German manufacturers, and they produce, for some companies, over 50% of their sales in new cars goes to China. So if the Chinese market recovers, if the Chinese consumer and retail becomes even more active than it is at the moment, this is good for Europe. But that is also actually good for the United States. That's good for the rest of the world. So the Chinese consumers, the Chinese factories are absolutely essential. So the figures which have just come out are broadly welcomed in Europe. So there are areas of concern, but with any statistics, with any economic figures, you have both a positive balance sheet and also partially a negative balance sheet. And that is no different in this case. But I think the outlook is good, and I think we hope that the 6% can be maintained. Some critics have said, no, it will drop to 5% or even lower. This is not widely shared, but of course the danger always exists that expectations are not being fulfilled. But I think everyone or most analysts are optimistic that around about 6% can be maintained in the future as well.
Einar Tangen, the Financial Times headline on this story is, and I'm quoting here, China warns of economic uncertainty despite moderate recovery in Q2. And as we saw earlier on in our report, the spokesperson for the National Bureau of Statistics referenced uncertainty stemming from the pandemic and factors such as the rising cost of raw materials. What kind of economic landscape do you see for China?
Right now, you have a situation where, as Grace pointed out, domestic demand is up, but it is not pre-2019 levels yet. So there's still room to grow. Luckily, China has been able to make that up through the exports, and that's what you're seeing reflected in these numbers. But China's trajectory is not so much about these big picture items that we're talking about. It's really about SMEs, small, medium-sized business entities, because they provide 90% of the new jobs. And from those jobs, you have disposable income, and that's what really drives a tertiary economy, this ability to make choices. So right now, you're seeing the government paying a lot more attention to that. They had a very small fine-tuning move this week where they reduced the bank reserve ratio, and that unleashed about 1 trillion renminbi, 150 billion US dollars, very, very small in comparison to the economy. But you can see that they have their eye on the ball, and I always believe that planning is better than not.
Jeff Moon, I want to get back to something you were talking about a few moments ago, and that is the pandemic. The New York Times notes that with so many countries now depending on Chinese factories and consumers, China's economic performance will have a big impact on how other countries emerge from the pandemic. How do you see it?
Oh, I agree with that observation. I'm especially concerned about the surge in COVID outside of China and how that's going to affect consumption, international consumption. Those exports, for example, that are going to other places will be affected by companies that can't consume them. And international supply chains that contribute things and people as well to the Chinese economy are in jeopardy. And inside China itself, COVID has resurged near some of the ports. It appears that some of that has been contained, but the threat is definitely there. And the Chinese vaccines have limited efficacy. And I don't think that the COVID story is over. This could be with us for quite a while. And we've already seen several waves in some countries. So I'm not predicting anything negative is going to happen in China, but we definitely do need to watch it and take it into account and be cautious with our economic outlook as a result.
Yanliang, China's central bank recently announced a cut to the reserve requirement ratio. That's the RRR, as it's known. That's for eligible financial institutions. That's expected to release about 1 trillion yuan. That's about $155 billion in long-term funds. How much of an impact will that have on China's economy?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. What I think is important is, as Einar Tangen talked about earlier, which is we need to make sure that these small and medium-sized enterprises are able to get the credit access. So I think instead of expanding credit, overall for the economy, it's more important to have a more targeted approach to make sure those SMEs are getting the credit. Because I think, an overall expansion of liquidity has its downsides. Jeff talked about that $18 billion of bond defaults in the early half of this year. And when we look at the private debt to GDP ratio, that reached 182%, which is 20 percentage points higher than last year, last year this time. So what that means is that continuing to increase liquidity could continue with that debt cycle, which is not necessarily conducive for the overall health of the economy. So I think it's important to have a targeted approach to make sure credit goes to the right places, to the right people. But I also think it's very important for the government to continue with fiscal stimulus. There are arguments about China need to rein in infrastructure construction. But I think quality infrastructure is still very important, like 5G towers, like last miles, railroads, and connection with, highways. And also many of the other important infrastructure still need to be built. Not to mention, government spending on social services and assistance. Right now, the government spending on these, social services and welfare, it's only accounting for about 0.6% of the GDP, which is lower than the emerging markets average of 1.6 or OECD countries 2.3%. So I think there is still a very large room for public spending to stimulate the economy instead of credit expansion.
Klaus Larres, I want to look at one sort of political dimension to this. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen this week called for a U.S.-European united front against China over what she called unfair economic practices. How much are strained relations between the United States and China pulling Europe into the debate?
Well, that certainly is the attempt of the Biden administration. The Biden administration initially simply wanted to get the transatlantic camp in order, and then they wanted to turn against both Russia and China and take these unfairnesses the Biden administration has identified on together with their European allies. These economic grievances, lack of market access, subsidy culture in China, and many other things, they have been around for many years, and complaints about that have been made for many years. So that is nothing new. But perhaps the Biden administration, being a new administration, wants to tackle these problems again with renewed vigor, and of course together with its European allies. So that isn't a characteristic of the Biden administration. Whether the Europeans will pull along is very much the question. While they sympathize, at least to some extent, with these economic grievances, they believe they are justified, at least to some extent. They also know that their largest market these days is in China. So they do not want to antagonize the Chinese government, Chinese businesses too much. On the other hand, they also don't want to simply sit by and accept unfair practices as they see them. So the Europeans are really in the middle between that unfolding battle between the United States and China in an economic sense, and they don't really want to side too clearly with either side. Though, of course, the United States is the long-standing ally of the United States, of the Europeans. So that is a real dilemma for the Europeans. And I think at the moment we have not seen a solution how that dilemma can be overcome and can be resolved. But I think the future promises a more careful maneuvering of the European countries, and particularly leading countries such as Germany and France, for example, between the United States and China. But in principle, they do share many of the economic grievances the Biden administration has identified.
Einar Tangen, what is your reaction to Secretary Janet Yellen's accusations about China and this call from the Treasury Secretary for a united front against China?
Well, I'm amazed at it is definitely a post-hypocrisy world. I mean, if you want to talk about subsidies, unfair practices, sheltering of industries, and now the U.S. is embarking on a program where it's going to directly subsidize, or planning to directly subsidize, different industries in an effort to catch up. The same is true in Europe. I mean, Boeing and Airbus decided to put away their differences because both are subsidized. You know, agricultural items in the EU are in fact protected. So this call that somehow the U.S. and Europe are these wonderful, you know, ethical entities and they're somehow being cheated by China is nonsense. If there were any problems with this, the appropriate place to take them was the WTO. China came out. In some cases, there were legitimate complaints, and China complied. So I find it very difficult to listen to this idea that is put out there and accepted as fact that China is always the one at fault. Just as you know, my friend from Washington said, you know, Chinese vaccines are proven ineffective or less effective than others. That's nonsense. I mean, AstraZeneca, the chiefs came out and just said, hey, listen, you know, we need an extra jab. That was poo-pooed immediately by the CDC. I mean, the fact is we are in a situation where we're facing a pandemic of unknown proportions. We've had various variants. We expect more. And of course, there's going to be need. But somehow poo-pooing what China's doing when it's put out hundreds of millions of doses to the rest of the world, whereas the U.S. is struggling to put out tens of millions, that's very hypocritical.
Jeff Moon, what's your response to that?
There are so many issues there that it's difficult to respond to all of that. But I don't think anyone's blaming China for all the ills of the world, despite what's just been said. But Janet Yellen is just speaking the truth. It is correct. These are long-standing grievances where China has denied market access. Let me just give you one example. The great breakthrough, one of the great breakthroughs in the European Investment Agreement, which has now been scotched over human rights issues, was that China finally opened its market to cloud services, a technology that the United States invented, China systematically blocked, and is now trying to propagate all the way around the world. There are many, many examples. And as for subsidies, don't mistake the exception for the rule. China, as we've talked about many times on this show, is a state-led economy that systematically subsidizes and causes overcapacity and a variety of other problems.
All right.
As for COVID,
Go ahead.
No, as for COVID, I just look at countries like Chile and other places that have relied on some of the Chinese vaccines and look at the results.
Okay.
And compare that to what's happening in the United States.
All right, Anna, a quick response from you, and then I want to move on.
Well, I mean, he can certainly espouse what he thinks, but the exception is the rule, and he hasn't addressed the issue of hypocrisy that's involved in this. You know, painting China as the sole entity out there that is primary. He glossed over the fact that the U.S. imposed unilateral sanctions not only on China but on also on its quote allies and things like this. So you know, this idea that the U.S. is a good actor and China is a bad actor, we should be moving on from that because it just simply isn't true.
Okay, I want to move on right now to Yanliang. Yanliang, China hopes, I want to talk about the labor market. You mentioned that earlier on. China hopes to create 11 million new urban jobs this year, but as our reporter pointed out, unemployment in the 16 to 24 age category is running at about 15%. Given that, I mean, is it possible to create this large number of jobs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that is very important for China's dual circulation, relying on consumer demand strategy, because that means we need more job creations to be able to provide, robust income growth and therefore consumption growth. So I think it's not only important to rely on the private sector, the SMEs that we talked about that account for, over 80% of job creation, but also importantly, I think the government has a strong role to play in providing, public sector jobs, especially as China now is undergoing so much, structural reforms. For example, the idea of decarbonize to establish, alternative energies. And we have all these 9 million college graduates who are, potentially very productive. And so I think they could, get a lot of job opportunities in, let's say, the green energy sector and health in education. So I think the government, the central government, could step in and create some of the public sector jobs, be it in the government level or in the community level, to provide productive and socially productive jobs for these young people, young and educated people. And going back to the previous question about unfair practices, we all know that China can still make improvements on market access, on many of other areas that the United States demands. But I think there are two important points here. One is that every country has their own unique economic system. If we do want to have a multilateral rule-based system, then the United States needs to resist the kind of unilateralism and establish maybe healthy dialogue, like the strategic and economic dialogue that started in 2006, but halted by Trump and still had no sign to resume. So I think important dialogues need to continue, and both sides need to find a way to work with each other instead of taking this unilateral hostile approach to each other.
Klaus Larres, I've only got a minute left, but we are aware that both the United States and Europe, trying to emerge from the pandemic, a lot of countries have slowed down reopening their economies, the United Kingdom being an exception, of course. But how would you assess the European recovery right now?
At the moment, it's a recovery which is on a good projectile. It is doing well. Particularly Germany has an incidence rate of just under 6. Improving, so they have done a good job with that very severe lockdowns and then gradual openings. And the lockdowns are not entirely over yet in Germany. In Germany, for example, or on the continent of Europe, they view what the UK is doing very skeptically. The UK opens up on the basis that many people have been vaccinated and then allows really no provisions, no mask wearing. Back to normality is the motto in the UK. And that is viewed quite skeptically on the European continent. Here, a much more slower approach to reopening has been taken. So far, that has been successful, but the Delta variant is around and has made deep inroads, both in the UK and on the continent. And as was said before, we really don't know how that is playing out, and that may have deep economic effects on the entire world, including China and the Europeans.
Einar Tangen, very quickly, what should we be looking for in the next 6 months?
In terms of China, you'll continue to see exports rise despite the pandemic. Everyone seems intent on opening up their economies. That means exports will continue to be good. Have to wait and see how they do on the SMEs. I agree with Grace.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.